So we're live. Welcome everybody to the 1000 Plateaus reading group that I put together. Just some introduction. I don't know if Jason wants to say something about the new center, but we're working in conjunction with the new center, which is a really cool extra university sort of academic center, which was started by Jason. I don't know, do you want to say something about it? And Mohammed.
Yeah, it was co-founded by myself and Mohammed Salemi, and we actually waited because we didn't want to be known as, like, we didn't want to have arguments about who the founder is. So essentially what we did is we got together the entire board of directors beforehand. We got together most of our instructors beforehand, and ourselves, and we basically co-founded it as a large group, so that there wouldn't be arguments over that question. But yeah, so we're here as basically a platform for reading groups, for discussion groups, for obviously for seminars, which we have all the time. In our first couple of years, we did lots and lots of roundtables with prominent writers and thinkers, kind of like what you might see at a conference or something like that. We just did them as like one-off events, and we did reading groups on Marx's 3 volumes of Capital. We did a couple other reading groups on like Isabel Stenger's and other figures like that. So I'm really excited that we're finally getting back into this. We kind of took a little bit of a break, and we started doing things more like trying to find, for example, Silvia Federici gave a talk in Portland, and there were all these people posting saying, oh, I can't actually make it to the talk. Is it going to be recorded? And in many cases, when people do these in-person events, there's, people forget to do any kind of recording or like live rebroadcast or live streaming or anything like that, where they just don't think of it as being like a major thing they want to do. So that's something that we also do. And just recently, we've massively expanded our public section of the new center, meaning completely free of charge. Videos, we have 100+ hours of videos that you can find if you go to thenewcenter.org. It's spelled in the Canadian way with an R-E instead of an E-R. Thenewcenter.org, you click on public, and you can find hundreds of hours of video, seminar videos and roundtable videos that we've done. We've probably done about 60 different roundtables and reading groups and things like that over the past 5 years. So all of those things are free, and you don't have to be a member to be in this reading group. This is Jacob's this is part of Jacob's final project for his certificate from the new center. So we're not requiring that you be a member, but it does take time and money to organize this kind of thing, and to make sure that everybody gets the Hangout link, and that there's like a prominent online presence and that kind of stuff. So if you're able to become a member, you can become a member for as low as $15 a month, kind of like Netflix or something like that. We think of ourselves as something along the lines of, when NPR says listener-supported radio, that's essentially what we're doing too. Is because we're 100% funded at the moment. We're 100% funded by tuition money and just people becoming members and that kind of thing. But like I said, you don't have to become a member. You don't have to donate. But if you're able to, that'd be great. So yeah, so that's the new center, and enjoy the reading group.
Sweet. So thanks, Jason. So just, I think that we should start with introductions. And I'll start. My name is Jacob Van Geest. I am a certificate student at the new center. I will be starting a master's degree in critical theory at Western Ontario, starting in the fall. And part of why I wanted to do this reading group is that 1000 Plateaus is really a book that made me fall in love with philosophy again a number of years ago, and it's a text that kind of grounds a lot of my thought, and a lot of the things that I write about and the things that I think about really come out of this book, and the way that I think about things really comes from this book. And so I wanted to explore it again, and I wanted to explore it with others. And so I thought putting together a reading group with other people who were interested in looking at this text and trying to figure out what it is that's going on, and what exactly they're trying to do, whether it's empirical, whether it's prescriptive, just what is going on in this text. And so I'm really excited to explore that with all of you. So I think for introductions, it's probably easiest if I name you off, because I think everybody's order on their screen is a little bit different. I'd prefer it if you could put on your video when you're talking. I know some people might not be comfortable with that, but it just makes things easier. So if you are uncomfortable with it, feel free to leave your video off. And if you don't want to give it an introduction, that's okay too. I completely understand. But so if we can start with Alex, that'd be great.
Okay, hi, I'm Alex. I have read like one chapter of 1,000 Plateaus. Oh, is there another Alex?
No, it's just you, I think.
Okay. And so I'm not really very familiar with it, but I'm excited.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Dave, if you'd like to go again, it'd be great.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Dave again. So I've been a friend of the New Center now for like a year. I took Ray Brassier's class on Marx and Levi Bryan's class on difference and repetition, which was my first excursion into dualism. And so I'm really excited to get to D&G. I've read a few of the Plateaus, couldn't make heads or tails of them. I've read some secondary stuff. I'm a big fan of Brent Adkins' Companion so far. At least it's helping make some more sense of these things. And so I'm really excited for this opportunity. Thanks for having me. Jacob, you're muted still.
Thanks, Dave. So the next person, I'm not sure how to say your name. Hyacinth. I'm probably brutally messing that up.
Isn't that a flower? Hi, Cynthia. Yeah.
Yeah, like the flower, but with an E at the end. Is my sound okay? I don't think I've spoken yet.
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Okay. My name's Hyacinth de la Santa May. Let's see. I haven't taken any classes or anything, seminars with the New Center yet. I might have seen one or two of them, and I've stalked their YouTube channels. But I am a poet and translator. I just finished my first book of poetry, and I'm working on a Italian text from the 90s about aliens and communism. But a few years ago, in college, I read 1,000 Plateaus with some girls online, but that was just our own informal reading. And I never read it when I was in college, but there's a lot to say about it, and it's exciting to get to go through it in a more, I don't know, rigorous way. Do I want to use that word? Whatever, with other people. So yeah.
Awesome, thank you. So Matt Baker.
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I'm Matt. I live in New Jersey, and my background is not in philosophy at all. My background is in the sciences. I work in the church. I'm a musician. And let's see, I met Jacob when we were, I also host a philosophy and theology podcast called The Catacomic Machine. And we were doing a reading group on Spinoza's Ethics. And I'm sure Jacob learned a few things from me as to how not to run a reading group. But it was a good time anyway, kind of going through that text, who is sort of foundational for Deleuze. So I'm interested in that sort of genealogy of Nietzsche, Deleuze, Lucretius, and all those guys. And I'm really happy to be a part of this and digging into Deleuze and Guattari. And I'm not so much interested in sort of like getting it right. You know what I mean? Like somebody, if that was possible, I think somebody would have done it already. I'm interested in like how it. I feel like when I read it, my thinking changes, if that makes sense. So, yeah, happy to be here.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Matt Bernico?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Last name is Veronica. So
Bernico? Okay, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I'm just being a dick. Hey, I'm Matt. I'm here because I like Deleuze and Guattari. I read this book first when I was in my master's program, and after I finished, I kind of put it down and didn't really get back to it. And then today, I picked it back up and started reading it again, and it's a lot different than I remember, which is pretty cool. So looking forward to reading it with you all.
Awesome. Thank you. Simon?
Simon here, yes. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, I met Jacob, and I also been in contact with Matt, and we've been doing a reading circle together before. But Deleuze is a recurring habit for me. I come back to the works from time to time. Now I have been reading Thousand Plateaus in Swedish a couple of years ago, so this is my second take at it, and I've been doing a lot of reading at both the Deleuze and secondary, and I feel I'm getting a very different vibe this time. So I'm looking forward to share it with you. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Tegan.
Hey, can you see me?
I can hear you.
Okay. For some reason, oh, there we go.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Tegan. Or Tegan. I go by both. I don't really know how to introduce myself most of the time. I do a lot of things. I'm an artist, I guess, and this is going to be probably like my third or fourth time reading 1,000 Plateaus this past year. So I'm excited. Yeah.
Sweet. No, that's good. So thank you all for being willing to introduce yourselves. So just one thing before we start, and you guys look like you're all ready for it, but if you're not talking, just try to mute yourself. It makes everything easier. If we don't do that, you can get into like a terrible feedback loop. So yeah, just keep yourself muted when you're not talking. I don't think there's any other like basic ground rules or things like that. Feel free to jump into the conversation at all times. Oh, Dave, I think if you have it clicked on somebody, if you just unclick that person, it should go automatically to who's ever talking. I don't know if that'll help. So I can't exactly remember where I was going, but so I was thinking we could spend about 30 minutes on rhizome and perhaps 30 minutes on micropolitics, and then so we are then in about an hour from now. We can take a small break in between the two. And this isn't to say we have to spend the whole time on rhizome and then the whole time on micropolitics. There's interlapping and intersections on throughout all of the plateaus. So yeah, we don't want to make rigid the various plateaus. But I thought we could start There's a quote I really like from Masumi in his introduction. I think it's on the last page, but I can't remember. Yeah, it's on the last page. It's the last thing he basically says in his translator's foreword. And I think it's really helpful in reading the text. So Masumi says, the question is not, is it true, but does it work? What new thoughts does it make possible to think? What new emotions does it make possible to feel? What new sensations and perceptions does it open in the body? And I think this is really helpful when reading the work because it's dense and it's really tough to figure out what's going on sometimes. And believe it or not, sometimes the book even gets a little bit boring. Not for a lot of it, but there are parts where it does get boring. So I think it is useful to sometimes set parts of it aside or just plow through a section if it's not working and try to get to the next one. Because I think I think that way of reading is much more helpful than trying to figure out every single thing that's going on in the text. And then I wrote a couple of things to just, I think are important to keep in mind when reading this. I think something that's central for Deleuze is that questions are much more important than answers or solutions. So rather than being critical of solutions, I think it's much more important to be critical of the questions that are raised in the text and the questions that we raise about the text. So for instance, it can be easy to ask a question like, what does capitalism, how does this concept undermine capitalism? But it might be better to think about, well, what does capitalism do, or what is capitalism? And how does capitalism function within this structure? Because asking the question of how we undermine capitalism already presupposes what that structure is. And so by thinking through what the structure is first, we can begin to think about how to undermine it. And we see that in the segmentary plateau in terms of fascism. They go out and try to show what capitalism does, or what fascism does, rather than just saying, how do we undermine it? And I think the other thing that we should keep in mind is that there's going to be some wild, crazy things said in this text. And so I think it's key to try to be charitable and figure out what they might be trying to say before we critique something. I think that's always a really helpful thing to do in philosophy. For me, at least, try to be as charitable as possible. Now, I thought we could just start by starting to read through the rhizome plateau and just see what springs up. That is, unless anybody has any sort of really important question that they would like to get us started with. All right. So we can start reading and then see what comes up. So they start. The two of us wrote AntiOedipus together. Since each of us was several, there was already quite a crowd. Here we have made use of everything that came within range, what was closest as well as farthest away. We have assigned clever pseudonyms to prevent recognition. We have kept our own names. Why have we kept our own names? Out of habit, purely out of habit, to make ourselves unrecognizable in turn, to render imperceptible, not ourselves, but what makes us act, feel, and think. Also because it's nice to talk like everybody else, to say the sun rises when everybody knows it's only a matter of speaking, to reach not the point where one no longer says I, but the point where it is no longer of any importance whether one says I. We are no longer ourselves. Each will know their own. We have been aided, inspired, multiplied. Now, I really like the line that says, to reach not the point where one no longer says I, but the point where it is no longer of any importance whether one says I. I think that to put it into a contemporary context, we could think about it, I think, in terms of something like gender identity. The point and we could rephrase it as something like the point is not to the point where one no longer considers themselves a man, but to get to the point where it is no longer of any importance whether one says oneself as a man, where it doesn't matter anymore, where that identity is sort of lost. I just sort of like that sentiment. Does anybody have anything that kind of popped out at them while reading that first part? Or perhaps we could start by asking a question. What is a rhizome? And how does that sort of come about?
Someone just asked the question whether they could just jump into this class without having read the book. I'm hoping that this person will join us. But speaking of rhizomes, I mean, one of my favorite things about the book is that you can just start kind of anywhere. You know?
Yeah.
It's designed to be, like you said, like a record album,
Mm-hmm.
And you could just sort of put the needle down wherever you might want to put it. And I would say even if somebody had not read the first chapter, they could still jump in here and get something out of it, and then go back and read it probably, just because of the nature of it's such a materialist text. You know, I mean, it is very philosophical, but it's so materialist, and it's so wrapped up in like very specific questions and problems, material discussions and things like that. That to do an overview of it would be almost impossible, really. I think, and so to me that's part of why it's possible to just kind of jump in anywhere. And I really like that, but I also like the way that the reading group is organized. It's chronological, right? The way it goes.
No.
Oh, it's not?
No. So I started with the rhizome plateau.
Yeah.
And then go over to the 9th plateau. So I really wanted to do the nomadology second, but it's so long.
I see.
So we'll be doing the nomadology next week. Because I actually feel like the nomadology and the apparatus of capture function as like a sequel to AntiOedipus more so than 1,000 Plateaus as a whole.
Right.
So they seem like a starting point for the book. But to keep this week's reading reasonable, we did the rhizome and the micropolitics and segmentarity.
Okay.
So
okay. Nice. Yeah, so you're approaching it in exactly the way that they more or less suggest. So that's great.
Yeah, just Andrew Culp actually gave me the rough structure, and then I edited a little bit.
Nice.
So yeah, the way he recommended reading it. So I kind of went from there.
Cool.
You know, it really didn't occur to me the first time through, but sort of riffing off of what you just said, it now occurs to me that what in this first paragraph, they're sort of kind of putting themselves forward as authors, and that authorship as a rhizome, right? They're not just two, but they're a multiple. There's a sort of suspension to some extent of subjectivity. And let's see here. Why have we kept our names, but we have pseudonyms at the same time? So they're sort of doing like this. It seems contradictory, but I think it's sort of pointing towards what they want to get to immediately following with the concept of the rhizome, but they're just kind of applying that concept to their own sense of authorship.
I think that works when they say that they would just like get up in the middle of the night, write 5 lines, and then walk away. And if they had written something 20 minutes later, the book would have been completely different. That definitely gets to the like heterogeneity of the rhizome. That there's not like this single sort of universal book, that the book and the author speak in different voices at different, like that there isn't an author, there is authors.
Is there also something going on here with habit, purely out of habit, right? Is it kind of getting at the idea that words themselves, order words, you know, the way that we make sense of the world, the way that we're told to make sense of the world it's easy to slide into. It's really comfortable because it's a habit, but also it makes us unrecognizable. And I don't know, this is a half-baked thought, so I need other people to pile in.
I think the habit part is very important, and it reoccurs later in the book too. And I see it when I read the whole introduction and also the beginning, how the first part is about describing the book in itself. That the book is the rhizome. They are about to do something that is what they are describing, and there's a material aspect to it, and there is this also that even when they go into this rhizomaticness that has this multiple openness, still they don't get lost in it. Still they are able to keep their own names. That's what they say in the first phrase. We will go into this multiplicity, and we will go in and out of different characters, but we will not lose ourselves, as they say. we will just not care anymore. We will just keep on writing and keep on finding new openings and beginnings, and so but we will still be Deleuze and Guattari at the end somehow.
Yeah, I wonder if that ties into like the idea of Master of Speeds, which Jason has written about, where like there's like, if you just deterritorialize with the black hole, you do lose yourself. So the goal is not to simply deterritorialize and lose yourself and lose the I, but to master the speeds in such a way that the I is still there, but it's no longer its same rigid sort of self.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that this habit could also be read in a slightly different key as convention, right? To say I is like, oh, I know what you mean. You're talking about, you know, who you are as a body, as a person. You have a name and these sorts of things. Yeah, but it's more of a convention. We're used to using these kinds of these kinds of ideas.
I don't want to be that guy that just skips ahead in the book, but I'm going to be that guy that skips ahead in the book. In a section coming later that's titled "How to Make Yourself a Body Without Organs," they go into this a lot more in a pretty wild way. But basically, they said just what Jacob did, that you can't deterritorialize to infinity. You have to sort of like deterritorialize and reterritorialize. But they have this kind of funny way of talking about it in the sense of like the crafting of oneself or making your body without organs is something that you have to do that's like cautious. Like you have to have a little bit of land in reserve somewhere else, always kind of retreat back to. And I think there's something about that going on here too, out of habit, and to talk like everyone else is like to not be lost in the midst of the rest of the writing.
Yeah, there's something like this, a small plot of, I haven't read that far ahead, but something about a small plot of land, right?
Well, and I think we get something along that lines in the segmentarity plateau too. Right, it's the fourth sort of danger that they list. What's it called again? The danger of despair. I think it is in this translation. I think it's translated as something else in some other translations, but which is just this absolute negative sort of deterritorialization, which they suggest is what leads to fascism. That fascism is this sort of suicidal state, to use Virilio's term, where it's just deterritorialization becomes the only objective, and that's what fascism leads to. It's just this pure negativity without any sort of positivity.
If I jump in there, with going further to page 4 and 5, instead of skipping ahead. Early on here, the distinction comes between the tree and the rhizome. It pops straight in. And I realize when I read it now that how easy it is to have this conception that somehow the tree is the bad and the rhizome is the good. And that they're trying to appeal for some kind of rhizomaticness, some kind of new salvation. But it's so much more complex, and I love an image that has stuck in me is that how the rhizome is formed in the trees, the rhizome is formed of trees, and there is no they compose of each other. A rhizome is just composed of many small trees, and in like the roots and in everything, there are no strict division between these two concepts. And yeah, that's how is that something you also have, or how do you think about it?
Yeah, this actually leads to one of the questions that I have about what's going on here, and that's whether the rhizome, the root radical, and the tree, whether these are all different sort of things, that's probably not the best term, or whether they're different ways of mapping the same sort of things. That's something that I've sort of struggled with, like which is going on here. Is rhizome just an alternative way of mapping, or are there rhizomes and trees? That's something I'd be interested in hearing others' thoughts on.
I was thinking about like why they chose. Okay, I'm not muted. I was thinking about why they chose like this botanical sort of metaphor for the concept of the rhizome, because it was quite interesting that they chose like this root or taproot kind of structure, and then the fascicular root, and then the rhizome, because they're all essentially plants, and like the rhizome, it's talking only about root structures. Like they're all, I think about the fact that like a ginger rhizome, I brought one from my kitchen, but it's just like a crazy thick thing, and like roots can come from any bit of this bit, and shoots can come up from it, and it continues to grow laterally. But like it's a tree, it can be a tree. And there was a greater point, like if they wanted these things to not be interconnected, I think the rhizome, they could have used like a fungal sort of metaphor for the rhizome, and using them from both of using both all of these concepts from the vegetal kingdom, like makes them all collapsible within this greater thing. So I think like the part when they're talking about how like rhizomes sit at the crutch of a branch or a can, and all of this roots can shoot out from the rhizome or the stolon or whatever. So let's see.
I think that when you similar is because in a way they are both images of something larger, and I would like to stick my neck out and say like it's actually like life in itself, that these two metaphors trying to grasp with, that's why they are so biological in a sense. Because there is something that none of these concepts can actually accurately map. But there's yeah, and that I would say is life.
And maybe it's important to, I mean, one bit that I highlighted here is that I highlighted, writing has nothing to do with signifying. It has to do with surveying, mapping, even realms that are yet to come. So yeah, I think, and you know, I think that yeah, these are metaphors, these are concepts, but we have to understand them as such, right? And I think what Simon just said kind of gets to that point. And we're trying to kind of get it. What are they actually getting at here, right? If we're sort of remain in the realm of the signifier, we're going to sort of fall short of what they're getting at. I mean, I think maybe one way to sort of an inroad into this is, and maybe this is too simplistic, but in terms of order and chaos, right? Where there's already within order, there's already chaos, and within chaos, there's already order. So these two, we might invoke a dualism there, but in reality, there's a sort of plane of consistency, I guess what they would say, right?
Yeah, I think so. Like Spinoza's being, I think there's something very similar going on, and I think the attempt to reduce to a dualism is something that they're very much driving against. So, like on page 13, they're trying to attack this idea that they're simply reverting to a dualism. That tracing should always be put back on the map. And this is something I think is really interesting because it's really easy to fall back into a dualism when reading this book. I feel like a lot of commentators do that. They sort of posit the rhizome is good and the tree is bad. But I think that that's totally a misreading. The start is in the middle. It's not that these things are good or bad. It's just that the tree becomes this rigid, dogmatic sort of structure that's unquestionable, and that doesn't allow for any sort of change to take place. And so, if we want change, we have to be more rhizomatic, I guess.
Right, or that change is ineluctable, right? That we're already sort of
right.
We're already in flux, but that these dualisms are invoked as tools to help us kind of think through how these different how different sort of phenomenon are extended, and it's kind of gets back to that idea of pragmatics that Masumi talks about and that you started with.
Mm-hmm. So I had another question that I'd be interested in hearing people's thoughts on, and it relates to relating the two chapters together, the micropolitics chapter with the rhizome chapter. So in the rhizome, they seem to set up three sort of root systems. There's the tree, there's the radical, and there's the rhizome. And in the micropolitics and segmentary plateau, they seem to set up the supple or the primitive segmentary, the state or the rigid segmentary, which is overcoding. And then they put forward a third sort of segmentary, which might be called the barbarian segmentary. And so the rigid or the state puts forward rigid lines that are dogmatized, whereas the molecular, the segments are more in flux, they're changing. And the supple segments are always acting upon the rigid ones, attempting to change them. And there are relative changes that happen within a state structure, but what's needed for there to be absolute deterritorialization, so an absolute change in the structure, is that there needs to be a line of flight, and that comes from the barbarian segmentary, which intensifies the primitive, creating some sort of radical change where the structure is wholly different than it was before that line of flight. And what I'm wondering is whether these three sort of codings that happen in the micropolitics plateau, whether they map onto the three sort of root systems. I'm not sure that they do, but it would seem like at first glance that the tree structure maps onto the rigid or state segmentary, the radical dual. I'm kind of lost when it comes to the radical, but it seems like a fake rhizome of some sort. But that would seem to map onto the supple, and the rhizome would seem to map onto the barbarian. But I'm not sure if that actually is the case. So I'm kind of wondering how the rhizome fits into the structure of rigid, supple, and line of flight. And if anyone has thoughts on that.
Okay, I'm not sure as a complete theory, but I mean, maybe. I haven't thought about it enough yet. But I think that you're right, at least a little bit, because in, let's see, in the rhizome chapter, page 5, it says that the radical system or fascicular root is the second figure of the book to which our modernity pays willing allegiance. So if that's the case, if the radical is to modernity, then like the state is also to modernity, I suppose. So I think there's something to what you're saying that makes sense to me. Yeah, I don't know about the second or the first one though. Somebody else can take a stab at those.
Just a thought here. I think that when you try to do this kind of mapping, initially I hesitate to do that, because one of the points here is that how everything is mapping onto everything else all the time. So you cannot find these types. You have this, the concepts are open towards each other, and therefore you also have a connection between the rhizomatic, like this, as we see this low level flux, and the fascist state. There's a mapping going on crosswise all the time. So if you try to see this, if you try to write like straight lines, 3 straight lines between 3 concepts on each side, then you're kind of missing what he's doing here, because there's an impossibility. Each concept is open in every direction towards the other concepts. That's what they're trying to do. That's how they're trying to fuck your head with. Like they're trying to fuck with you all the time, and you try to map on these kind of structures.
No, I think that's a really good point.
So I didn't get to read all of the one on segmentarity again, so I missed the bit about the barbarian segmentarity. But just sort of reading it, I got the impression that, like, thinking about, I guess, the different segments visually, I was like, let's see, there was some bit on describing like the binary segmentarity, the circular segmentarity, and the linear segmentarity. And I was thinking that the sort of rigid and supple were different ways of moving about those segments. And so, okay. So thinking about it from like the root thing, I was thinking that like these can, there can be supple movements, I guess, in a tree-like system. I mean, I think of this biologically, like the way that roots would redistribute sugar flows and shit, depending on what needs to go where, so to accommodate more growth in different directions. And rhizomes do this too. Like they have, ginger can change the channels that things are flowing on. If one gets cut off, that's part of the reason why they're able to cut them up and they'll grow from whatever, because they have very easy ways of moving stuff. But different parts of the ginger plant are also incredibly susceptible to like heat damage. So if you damage it, it's all fucked, and it won't grow again. So I got like the idea that maybe these things, I don't know that they're related, and I didn't get that impression when reading it. I got more so that it was like sort of a, not a question of speed, but like one of regulating of speed or the direction of that speed. I don't know.
Right, it's about the regulation of flows of one kind or another. They use, I think, the examples. I mean, we're in the register of the political, right? So there's desire, there's power, and those are the kind of are the examples that sort of circle around those flows, and so I think they are related. I think it would be, I'd have to give it more thought as to like, yeah, how specifically to relate them, but I think Simon's point is well taken, that there is a temptation to kind of think analogically, and there may be some merit to that and some value to that, but we should also be cautious about it too. They are trying to fuck with us, you know what I mean? And the register of or the context, I guess, of the rhizome, it seems much more broadly applicable. I mean, it's in, which makes more sense for an introduction, I guess, for a text like this. But and this has this more specific context with micropolitics, macropolitics, and stuff like that. And one more thing, like with the dualisms. I mean, even here with the segmentarity, I don't know where it is. I was trying to find it, but they are both sort of mutually implicated or coextensive, right? So it's another dualism that's that they're invoking, but it's not a real dualism. It's a ploy, you know. So anyway, that's all I got, because my phone is like on 1% and it's gonna die. So I enjoyed the time, and I'm gonna bounce, but I'll see you guys next time.
Thanks for coming.
All right, peace, guys.
Bye.
Yeah, I think that speaks to this idea that when we're talking about different sort of things, a lot of the time we're talking about difference in degree rather than difference in kind. I don't know if that's always the case, but these things are always interlocking and presuppositional, and they always rely on one another. So they're not so much like antagonistic as they are like mutually affirming.
Yeah, like I think there's a reason why it's tripartite. Like there's three, and they're I want to be woo and say that it's like a numerological type thing, but it's unavoidable that they're supposed to be constantly talking with each other.
Can we talk about the pluralism and monism note in the chat? Because when I was reading it, I was kind of thinking about that too, and I don't really know. I don't have any really big thoughts about it, but just I want to know more about that bit. The insistence on pluralism and maybe how that relates to the monism that Deleuze kind of does elsewhere. Anyone have any thoughts?
Yeah, Tegan, if you want to type it out, I could read it out for you. But I think the pluralism equals monism is always an interesting sort of thing that's so difficult to wrap your mind around. I wonder if it has to do with some sort of Spinozist metaphysics, where in order for there to be multiple, there has to be sort of a univocity of being, that change would be impossible. So difference would be impossible without that univocity. So it goes against that critique of Spinozism that you can't have change or difference within the univocal. But for Spinoza and Deleuze, you can't have change without that univocity.
How I interpret it is that you have this. For me, it's closer to the Leibnizian notion that he picks it up, and that at each level of reality, it's not like enough to say like pluralism that like there is pure difference, but rather that there are like assemblages made up of assemblages, and then they intertwine into different assemblages, and everything is this connectedness. So pluralism does not mean that you don't have you cannot analyze something separately as in themselves, but you can never like fully separate something from the rest. You always have to see it in its interconnectedness to the other parts, and that's how the book is written. It's like this: you can have concepts, separate concepts, and that's the pluralism of it. But it's still like separate yet very diverse. Something. Yeah, sorry.
That's good.
So I can't really, I guess, talk in like the hardcore philosophical voice about this, but like my understanding of, I think of like sort of a mathematical model of two cones that of course spiral to one single point. Like at one point you have these large sort of molar entities, like different bodies that are made of different molecules and such. So like there's this infinitesimal side of everything, the molecular side, and then there's this molar and macrocosmic sort of side about it. And I'm really biased because my referent is poetry, so I immediately go to like, oh god, this is basically articulating like a metaphysics of ecstasy in some way, where like you're experiencing this massness and this incredible particularity at the same time. And I of course don't have the voice to articulate the philosophical meat of it, but like it's I immediately just go to woo and whatever else. So I know they both had something going on that is more than what got written down, I guess. And that pluralism monism thing is trying to understand all of the complexities of what that implies in such a simple equation. I don't know.
One quick note: there is another hermetic formula which also has an equal, and that is the microcosm equals the microcosm.
Yeah.
And that you cannot understand the microcosm without the macrocosm. And
yeah,
that's
as above, so below.
Yeah, as above, so below. And for me, I read this kind of thing like, it would never write as above, so below, because that's too obvious, hermetic. So he fools us and then, writes monism equals pluralism, and we be so. But it's still something very, very ancient, stoic, hermetic going on here. Yeah, that's my short answer.
So did anybody have questions about either of these plateaus, that anything you didn't understand or really just lost you? I find it really difficult to think through the center of power that's going on in the ninth plateau having to do with fascism. I think Guattari's essay on fascism is helpful, but I always kind of get lost. Like, what is this microfascism? What is microfascism, and how do we think about this thing, or like or deal with it, or like what does it do? What does it? How does it impact our desire in such a way that everybody becomes a little bit fascist, or micro-Oedipus? Like, how does that work? It's easy to think about them on the molar level, but on the molecular level, it's much more difficult to figure out, to me at least, what's going on.
Jacob, can you give us a page number for microfascism?
They talk about it for sure on... I just had it. On 228, but that's not the first instance, if I recall.
Yeah, there's some stuff on 215 and 216.
They start talking about the center point. So on 228 for sure, they say, and this is like midway, it's like 2/3 or 1/3 of the page down. They say, quote, "First, supple segmentarity runs the risk of reproducing in miniature the affections of the rigid. The family is replaced by community, conjugality by a regime of exchange and migration. Worse, micro-Oedipuses crop up. Microfascisms lay down the law. The mother feels obliged to titillate her child. The father becomes a mommy." Yeah, I see. I don't know what that means at all, or not means, what that does, I guess.
My take on that is, and I will go back to the earlier quoted "as above, so below," because it's also relevant. And I think what they're trying to say is that you have these two versions of totalitarianism, but in the version you may call Stalinism is that you have this kind of flow, and I think they say that Stalinism is conservative, right, somewhere, because they try to.
Stalinism is totalitarian.
Yeah, but it's
conservative. It's conservative. Yeah,
it's trying to hold back
it puts up blockages. Yeah, it's all about blocking flows.
Yeah, it's blocking flows and trying to keep it as they are. But then it says, like, but fascism is very, very different, because it comes from below, and it's kind of more like, and I can almost hear it as a sound that, you know, you that, and he writes something that Hitler was like already. He just picked up a vibration going on in society, like many small vibrations going, and it came from below, and it was that he didn't try to block a flow. He tried to divert the flow. He tried to master the flow and try to take it forward, and actually towards death and the death drive, and that was the difference. So the microfascism is more like how the vibration of the subject somehow, and what happens when all the subjects are vibrating in the same tone. What happens on a molar level when you have reached that state?
Yeah, I think that's on the right track for sure. In AntiOedipus, they have a section. Sorry, I'm going to again being the guy that's going to reference the other dualism story books. That's my brand right now. In AntiOedipus, though, they talk a lot about. I mean, they ask that sort of like perennial question about fascism, like how did the masses come to desire fascism? And like, I mean, the point they end up at is just like there's something in them. And they elaborate on it in the book, but there's something sort of that produces those fascist desires. But to that point you're just making about sort of like the fascist, like I guess the molecular and then the molar fascism. There's a bit, even a little bit after what Jacob's reading on 228, that says a multitude of black holes may very well not become centralized and acts instead as viruses adapting to the most varied situations, sinking voids in molecular perceptions and semiotics, interactions without resonance. And I think there's something else going on there too, where maybe maybe the fascism, like at the molecular level, doesn't always, I guess, vibrate up to the molar, but there's some kind of connection that happens when there are resonances.
Yeah, it would seem to require some sort of line of flight that disrupted the molar in such a way that allowed that molecular to just go crazy. It has to like disrupt the blockages that are in its pathway.
Well, in a sense, you need a third term here, and that's what he is always talking about barbarian. You need the you need a middleman. You need and also in this sense, with this analogy, like Hitler is actually the line of light. He's the channel. He is the fascist, the microfascism finding its escape somehow into the molar level. And that's without these type, and therefore, you know, that like also like this is how you can use his terminology, because it's not like line of flight can also be talked about like this secret escape, this venture for freedom, but the line of flight can also lead you to fascism. It's not a neutral concept. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's good. Yeah, so I'll read off what Tegan said in the chat. I'm not super well versed in Sun Ra, so I'm sorry if I butcher it. I'm not super sure what's going on. Oops, I opened up a new tab. But Tegan says, Sun Ra says to consider the 3 O's. 3 OS, O plus O equals OS. This reminds me a lot of the statement pluralism equals monism. As first, IR reminds us that we exist in a constantly differentiating process, and also that this differentiation produces a heterogeneity. Also, interestingly, Rock claimed OS is the word for mouth, and reminds me a lot of the univocity of being with its relation to the voice / speaking. I can't really speak to that too much, but perhaps Tegan expands on it in their zine that's coming out. I'm not sure. But yeah, that's an interesting connection to make, and I think that's kind of what reading this book is all about, just connecting like to various things and connecting the text to different examples. So maybe we can think about whether these things that we've discussed so far, the other parts of this book, how do they connect to things that are happening now? And how can we use the text perhaps to think through these events? Not that it provides any answers, but it might unlock different questions about contemporary events.
So about that microfascism bit, there was a at the top of 216, there's just a short, it's after a colon, a macropolitics of society by and for a micropolitics of insecurity, which I think the footnote leads to something about Virilio, like a macropolitics of security for a micropolitics of insecurity. And like, oh God, I have to take this headphone out. Thinking about that through like the modern type of thing, I think about the micropolitics of what happens in between people with insecurity. Just sort of like what you see defined by critiques in media of selfie culture and online culture of, you know, the I'm trash memes. While at the same time, like, the globe is just increasingly more whatever. And I haven't thought of the connections between I'm trash and the world is going to trash, but obviously there's something there. And I'm not really too well read about the security thing there, and what insecurity would mean other than like the self-conscious kind of thing. But unfortunately, most
We can't hear you.
oh dear,
Oh, now we can hear you again.
I've covered up the mic. Just most of my thoughts were related to botany and biology and thinking about why they chose this as compared to that. Really thinking about like Michael Martyr and Luce Rigore wrote a book Through Vegetal Being that came out last year or something. And Michael Martyr's just written several other things about plant being and plant thinking. And just like how rich their botanical metaphors are. Like the orchid and the wasp thing in the first thing from Rhizomes is just very interesting because it's not the way that scientists think about it nowadays. And it'd be really great if...
I think you covered your mic again. No, we can't hear you. No.
I don't know. Does that work?
Oh, yeah.
I can't even remember what I was saying just then. But
I was thinking, and I got this picture also while I was reading, and that is somehow this is not about finding solutions, but it's like seeing the world as this kind of flow that constantly is coming towards us. Like this, something is always coming towards us. And this is just, you know, like different types of matrices in how we arrange those flows and what we do with them. And we can look around and see, it's like, how do we arrange the flows that are coming? But it's very hard for us to know beforehand what is the best alternative in each situation. We can only know that afterwards. But this is like, there's not for me like a positive solution going on at the end here, but just many matrices to be able to talk about the flows. Yeah.
I sort of had a question, and it's about resonance, because I saw that it came up several times, and at least in what I was able to read over the past few days, I didn't really see any exposition of what that concept of resonance is. I mean, I can think of what it is, and I'm sure that it might be explained later. I'll try to find the bit. I think it was in Rhizomes, or Rhizome.
Resonance has to do with like sound, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if it connects with the refrain plateau. Like there's rhythms that are produced which are crystallized in particular ways. But I'm not sure.
I can't find it.
Well, on the go ahead.
No, please. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, on that point of resonance, I guess there's a few, I guess, ideas that kind of stick out in my head, because you're right, it does come out in a few different ways. But I was thinking of resonance in that orchid and wasp and like the aparallel evolution kind of examples they're giving. Because I guess I'm thinking of resonance in like the sense that like the way like two sounds like reverberate off of frequencies, or like like a bell rings and you hear it kind of reverberate and resonate with another surface or something. So I guess to me the idea of resonance here makes me think of the sort of back and forth nature of things, or that like in the middle of but not like mimicry of two different flows. Mimicry seems like it's somehow caught up in this idea of resonance, in the sense that mimicry and resonance are not the same idea in their writing.
It's interesting that you bring up resonance in that case, because the orchid releases its pollen based on particular vibrations that the bee gives to it.
Mm-hmm.
And God, beautiful. But that is interesting, and it makes me think that there's maybe something between that rigidity and the suppleness of the segmentarity, or at least the flow of the segmentarity, based on that resonance. That I don't know much about music, but there are some like natural tones as a pair, as opposed to I don't know. I think of like that debate between A432 and A440 as something. It is a natural tone. I don't even know what the fuck they mean by natural there, but and then there's like, I forget, synthetic tones maybe. But yeah, that's a great point about the resonance.
So I was wondering, does anybody have any background in like Claude Lévi-Strauss or structuralism? Like structural anthropology? I'm just wondering because at least the beginning of the micropolitics seem to very much be in dialogue with Claude Lévi-Strauss. He was mentioned a couple of times. And I'm wondering if there's sort of a dealing with structural anthropology here in a way that isn't sort of super explicit, but may have been more explicit to people who were reading this in 78. Or at least people who have more of a background in that.
My quick take on that is that I think what they are responding to is this notion that they had maybe in the 40s and 50s more, and that is the possibility to compare cultures in like this kind of third of upper structure that you would be able to map onto all the primitive cultures in this, and they would have this unified language. And what is very important here, it's somewhere else, is in the rhizome there is no possibility for analogs. You have to see stuff very much more at their own terms in some sense, and there are no unifying There are no unified story here. You cannot find that perspective. You cannot find a structuralist perspective. You can find these lines of connections. You can find maybe even more connections with the Deleuzian method than with the structuralist method, because you're connecting it to each other at the same level. But that, I would say, is where he breaks off with the structuralist, is that there is no upper narrative, and there is this flatness somehow. Yeah.
So we have about 10 minutes left. We go to 9:45 and we started at 8:15, so that would be about an hour and a half, which is what we were planning on. Does anybody have any other thoughts or questions that they'd like to bring up, or just anything that they think is worth discussing?
Yeah, I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about the different so in the rhizome chapter, they're talking about the different things that make the characteristics of a rhizome, right? And I'm curious about how useful you all find that. Certain things just make a lot of sense. Like, yeah, it always starts in the middle. Heterogeneity is one of these aspects, but there were a couple, like AC defining rupture. I didn't really understand what that is. And then I've got questions about, like, it does seem like they're trying to do some. I know essentialism was not really in vogue at the time, and it hasn't really ever been since. And I'm curious if they're trying to. I'm curious what they're doing, as far as, like, in respect to essentialism. Like, okay, because there are all these different aspects that are characterizations of a rhizome. So is that to, like, say that without a couple of these, then it wouldn't be a rhizome, right? Are these necessary and sufficient conditions? Yeah, are they all necessary?
I think in terms of essence, I don't think that they're necessarily anti-essentialists, but I think they're essentialists in the Spinoza sense. And for Spinoza, an essence is not like a fixed essence of what a thing is. A thing's essence is what it does. So in essence, yeah, in Spinoza, it isn't fixed. It has to do with action. And so we could maybe say that these things are the essence of a rhizome insofar that they are what a rhizome does. And I think we have to consider how we think about an object like a rhizome or we have to think about the ontology in Deleuze and Guattari versus like a classical ontology. So like a classical formal ontology where the form is transcendent over content. And I think in Spinoza and in Deleuze and Guattari, they negate the form and they negate the form aspect, and it turns to expression rather than form, and expression is immanent to content rather than transcendent. And I think that then essence is no longer transcendental and it's essential, but it's immanent to what a thing does.
I would say almost the same thing in an other way, is to say that I don't believe there is such a thing as a pure rhizome. That's kind of the trick they do here, is that there is no purity. You cannot isolate these concepts and define them in their purity. You have robbed the world out of the possibility to be defined as pure. And all you can do is define its interconnectedness and how it related and its relatedness. And also, therefore, you can have more or less of these categories in place for it to be more or less like the rhizome. But the concept is never to be found in its purity. And neither of them, neither the tree nor the rhizome, is to be found in their purity. That's in a sense also saying why you have to start in the middle. Because there is no pure, there are no pure starting point anywhere else.
Maybe it might be helpful if we think about rhizome as tool rather than as like a transcendental category or something. So these principles that they're giving us, rather than being dogmatic boundaries for what is and is not a rhizome, are more or less things to help us identify the difference between a rhizome and a tree. And these things aren't like, again, they're not different in kind, they're just different in degree. They're different degrees of something that's in flux and in between things. And so these principles shouldn't be taken as dogmatic, but as a toolbox for helping us think about the differences between the tree structure, which tends to be, at least for us, dominant, and something that could potentially undermine that.
I think the like oftentimes in whatever I've had several times conversations with people about rhizomes, and the rhizome, like, okay, what is the best example? And it's frequently said that the internet is a rhizome. I don't really agree with that for a lot of reasons, but like the first one is obviously because it was founded by DARPA and has huge intelligence connections and lines running across the ocean. But like, I do think the internet is a great example of like a good idea of their talk about books in the first section, because yes, it has this like tree-like origin, but then you have places like 4chan and whatever else that are somewhat rhizomatic, and that they're not organized, and that there's people talking about all of these different things with somewhat like connections you would never expect. But then there's things like Wikipedia that are strictly organized and this, that, and the other. And there's something about the dark web there that would be really interesting, with like barbarian segmentarity maybe. But I just think the internet was really interesting to use their discussion of the books to think through. And even like the thinking about the radical, there's like different, there was a website once upon a time that would just serve you random sites when you clicked a button. And I think that is like thinking like a radical, because it allows you to basically, yes, stumble upon, thank you. But like, you could go from this game to, oh God, this designer in Korea. That's not really a good example of a radical, but it lets you think of like the secondary root system of this giant taproot. I thought the Burroughs example was really great because if you've ever read Naked Lunch, that is just everywhere, but you still get the feeling that like, oh, it's still connected. I didn't know there was a movie. Now I have to find the movie.
There's a Cronenberg movie. I don't know how related it is, but it's pretty good.
That'll be interesting.
Interesting, the internet example, because it's like the internet itself, the infrastructure. Sure, we're not quite there yet. In the documentary, The Third Industrial Revolution, which I saw pretty recently, it's by Vice, but it's a social theorist and economist. I don't know. Anyway, I'm not going to say anything about him or what he's really saying, but he does propose that the internet, though, is moving to that, where it will be a energy itself, like solar and other forms of energy, and then the internet itself will be. I don't know the technical terminology here because I'm not as techy as I should be, but that basically every house will be its like own kind of center, its own sort of node, and that if any one were to fall, or if like an entire city were to fall off the grid, like it wouldn't actually, nothing would be lost because like everyone has it and everyone's doing it or something. Like it kind of gets at like, I think it kind of gets at the idea about like blockchain and like data sovereignty and all those kinds of ideas. Although these are all things I don't know a lot about, and someone else could like tie those in. But what I was gonna say, so that's like the infrastructure side. But there's like definitely like with Stumble Upon, or even just the way that I have like 20 tabs open on my browser, and you kind of bounce from one to another, and you make these connections, and yeah, it's. I guess like the software side, or at least the experience side, feels a lot more rhizomatic, even if the infrastructure is not quite there yet.
I wonder if we could think about the difference between a file folder system and tab on or tagging and tags. Whether tags as an organization system are closer to something like a rhizome. I've never really used a tagging system because it seems like a mess, but
yeah.
But like file systems are very, very sort of tree structure, right? I have this file underneath it. I have this file underneath it. I have this file underneath it. I put these documents. Whereas the tagging system, it's just like, this is a red tag. And then I have all these things with the red tag. And some of them have the blue tag. And maybe this one no longer has the red tag. And this other one is giving the red tag now. But that sort of tagging system seems much closer to this rhizome, which is connecting in various ways at different segments of the tree. That gives no precedence to this tree structure. It doesn't care about it. It's just interested in the different tags, the different connecting elements.
I would like to add that when you talk about internet as this rhizomatic, you kind of have to also see that it's actually a highly, even hyper segmentized system. You have taken the flow of energies and then you have forced it into this binary thing, and then you highly make this IP thing going where you segmentize everything. This is strictly low level. This is what you get at a low level of highly what do you call it? Segmentation. At an upper level, then we marvel at the rhizomatic nature. But that's because you can have, at a low level, you have this very, very stable, very, very clock-like system, and you have servers and people working all day, night. Like it's sustained by a very, very, very stable and what we would call a tree-like system. So in this case, this freedom at an upper level is at a fundamental level something the opposite of it. as in some cases you have, like in nature, you have maybe more of a flux at a lower level and then a structure at a higher level. The internet is rather reverse, but still working with the same things.
Okay, so it is 9:50 here. So we should probably close the discussion for tonight. Next week, we will be reading, I think it's the second longest plateau. I think the Becoming plateau is longer, but we'll be reading the Nomadology, which is among my favorite plateaus. It's kind of fun. I really like it. Now, I'm wondering if anybody would be willing to put together like 3 or 4 questions to ask next week. This is what we did in Levi Bryant's seminars, and I think it's really helpful to just have a few questions. They can be really simple. They can just be like, what does this concept mean, or something like that. I just think that the questions are helpful at getting conversation going. So would anybody be willing? Dave, you willing to do that?
I'd like to get it out of the way and do it first. Yeah.
Okay, sweet. So Dave, let me just write that in a second.
Unless anyone else like it would really work best for them. It's not that important to me.
Sweet.
Sweet.
So we'll meet again next week at the same time. Thank you, Jason, for doing all the technical work, and thank you everybody for showing up and participating in a great discussion. All right, see y'all next week.
Great work. See ya.
Thanks, everyone.
So long.